On the right side of stockinette stitch, you'll have nice flat V's like this. I knit one row in gray, so it will be easier for you to follow along. On the wrong side of my fabric, I have rows of purl bumps. On this side, the gray row that I knit spans across a series of bumps. First, I have a row of gray bumps right here that resemble frowns. Then, there are two rows of bumps of cream, one that resembles smiles, right here, and the other that resembles frowns. This is followed by another row of gray bumps that resemble smiles. If I stretch out my fabric a bit like this, I'm able to see that the gray yarn travels through these cream bumps in the center, snaking up and down across my fabric. So here's the yarn going up, around, down, around and up, around and down, around and up. And it's going through these purl bumps in the center. So here it's going up through this frown, up through this smile, then around, down through this smile, then down through this frown, then around, up through this frown, up through this smile, then around, back down through this smile, and down through this frown. And it continues traveling along the fabric this way. I'm going to use a red piece of yarn as my end so that it's easy for you to follow along. And I'll find the nearest bump to where my end is. So in this case, I'll just start with this frown right here. And I'm going to weave in, duplicating this row of gray knitting. So I'll follow along the path of the gray yarn. To begin, I'll weave my end up through this frown. I want to get to this gray frown at the top, so I also need to bring my end up through this cream smile that's slightly to the left. Then I'll pull my end all the way through. Now I want to weave my end around this gray frown and bring it down to this gray smile at the bottom. So to get there, I'm going to go down this cream smile, and then I'll go back down through this cream frown that I initially started with. And I'll pull my end all the way through. Now I want to travel around this gray smile to get my end back up to this gray frown. So I'm going to bring my end up through this cream frown and then also up this cream smile that I recently came down through. And then I'll pull my end all the way through. Then I want to bring my end around this gray frown and back down to this gray smile. So I'll bring my end down through this cream smile and then down through this cream frown that I recently came up through. And I'll pull my end all the way through. Now I want to travel around this gray smile and come back up to this gray frown. So I'll bring my end through this cream frown and through this cream smile. So I'm bringing it through the frown and then up through the smile. And I'll pull my end all the way through. Then I want to bring my end around this gray frown down to this gray smile. So I'll bring my needle through this cream smile and cream frown. So I'm bringing it down through the cream smile and down through the cream frown that I recently came up through. And I'll pull my end all the way through. Keep weaving in your end following this path of the stitch until you've gone up and down a few times each. Once you are finished, trim your end, leaving about 1/4 inch of yarn, and then stretch your fabric a little bit to help your end settle in. As you can see on the right side of the fabric, you can't see the end that I wove in at all. Since you won't have a contrast color of knitting for you to follow the path of, it might be a little harder to initially find the path that you need to weave along. To help, I recommend first finding the nearest bump that you'll start with. Then, keeping an eye on that, stretch your fabric a little bit, and you should be able to see more clearly the path that this row of knitting is following. That's the row that you're going to duplicate when you're weaving in your end. There are a few different places within your project where you'll have to weave in ends, so watch the next few video clips for some tips and tricks on how to handle those. Here I added a new ball of yarn in the middle of my project, and I was knitting a hat. So here's my end, and I'm going to start by carefully untying this knot. Then I'll carefully pull apart my two ends like this. And I can see that between the two ends there's a hole in my project. To avoid having a hole in my project, I'm going to crisscross my ends, bringing this end over to the left and this end over to the right. Then I'll weave those ends in, going those directions, finding the nearest stitches and following along that path. In this example, I have an end at the brim of a hat that I knit. This end is from the tail when I initially started my project. This end is currently coming out on the right side of my fabric, but I want to bring it to the wrong side to weave in. So I'm going to find the nearest V, which in this case is directly to the right of my end, right here. And I'm going to bring my end through the center of that V, from the right side to the wrong side. So here's my end. I want to make sure to not go from the right side to the wrong side through this space that my end is coming out through, because that will start to undo my project. So I'll find the nearest V and come through the center of that V, bringing my end from the right side to the wrong side of the fabric. So now my end is on the wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to flip my project around like this. Then I'm going to find the nearest bump so that I can weave my end in along the path that it travels. So this bump looks good, but then when I look at the path that it travels, it goes to the brim of the hat, and that might be a little hard to weave in. So I'm going to find a bump slightly above, so this one looks good, and find the path that that travels. This looks like it'll be easy for me to weave my end along, so I'm going to go with that bump. So to get up to that bump, right there, I'm going to come up through this frown and up through this smile and pull my end all the way through. Then I'll weave my end in, traveling along the path that that bump travels.